Hi friends, welcome back. I'm Christina, the manager of the Pacific Beach Library. Thank you for joining me for day 15 of our read along together of Roughing It by Mark Twain. Today we're going to read 3 chapters together and, ooh, I should take out my tea. It's been steeping for a few minutes. We'll do a little housekeeping. We'll do a little talking about stuff. So first thing is I'm going to start by talking about my tea because I'm really excited by it. I don't know if you guys saw over the weekend, I attended a virtual tea workshop on Saturday. It was a lot of fun. And at the tea workshop, it was presented by this, the guy who is the founder of this company called Tea Source. And basically you could sign up to watch the workshop for free. But if you wanted to go ahead and register in advance, you could buy to have the teas shipped out to you. So I ended up getting 7 different samples of tea. And I thought we'd just over the next few days go over some of the teas, just for kicks. And so one of the things they were talking about was something that when he said it, I was kind of like, wow, that's amazing. And I was like, hang on, I might have heard that before and just forgotten. So I'm just going to throw this out there because maybe you too had either never heard this or had forgotten about it. Did you know that there are actually, despite the many varieties of teas, that there are there's one tea plant with just 2 species? A lot of the teas that we'd call teas are actually not technically made of tea, like for example, the herbal teas. Those are just other plants. But if it's a black tea or a white tea or a green tea or a dark tea or a pu'er tea, those are all the same plant. Fascinating. And basically the way the tea works is that there are 2 leaves that separate out, and then in the middle there's a little a bud. And so it's the 2 leaves in the bud, and just depending on which part you use, whether you just use the leaf, whether you use the leaf and the buds, or the leaves and the bud, or if you just use the bud, you might get different flavor of tea. It's also how you choose to dry it. Like, do you let it oxidize or not? So when it gets oxidized, it turns darker, and that's why you have the light tea or the green teas have less oxidation. A dark tea or pu'er tea, or then even the black teas that has more oxidation. Hello! And so fascinating stuff, just talking about how drying the tea in different ways changes the color and the taste of the tea. And when I say color, I mean like whether it's a white tea or a black tea or a green tea, all the same plant, all the same tea plant. Also too, just like with a lot of other plants, a lot of other foods, sort of where you grow it can affect the flavor. So again, kind of like wine and grapes, that you have wine grown in one region will have a different flavor than another region. And so like the tea we'll be trying tomorrow, it was a green tea, and they talked about how it has a taste of the sea in it. And they were saying like the similar tea grown in a more inland region would have a different taste. So we'll try that one tomorrow. This one that I'm trying today is called Baimudan. And he said that translates to white peony, even though there are no peonies in this particular tea. The description on it is, this complex tea is unique and medium-bodied, with hints of stone fruit and mineral spiciness that balance the overall sweetness of the cup. Wonderful and intriguing. Ingredients, just white tea. So this is only the tea, no extra little fruits or anything in it. Very nice. I wouldn't say that I would have noticed the stone fruit, but it is a light tea with a delicate flavor. It does have, I could see maybe a hint of sweetness in it. I also, right before we did our reading, I put a little lotion on my hands, so I feel like I'm getting the lotion smell too, so I hope that's not overpowering my nose. But this was a fun one too, because I just steeped it in, you've seen before, I have like a really large basket sitting in my teapot, and so it gives the tea lots of room to expand. The way the guy brewed this one when he did it was it looked like just a regular glass, like a drinking glass, and as opposed to mine that has like a handle on the side that's sort of squatter and fatter, he just had a regular, like a water drinking glass, and he put the loose tea directly into it and then poured the water over it. And he just said, like, as you can watch the tea expand. He didn't use a basket or anything, and just said that traditionally you would drink that one, just, you would leave enough space on the top so you could hold the glass. Let me turn it this way so you can see. You would hold it by the top where it wasn't hot. And then as you drank it, you would sort of use your teeth to sift it out to make sure you didn't get any of the leaves to drink. So that was the traditional way to drink this white tea, the Baimudan in China. So just want to throw that out there. That was today's tea that I'll be enjoying. I hope you are having something wonderful. And tomorrow, I'm giving you a sneak peek, we're going to have the tea that tastes like the sea. It was a weird one, but it was good. Okay, so now let's talk a bit about our books. Oh, also, looking ahead, if you want to vote, now is a good time to vote on what you'd like to read next. I didn't check this morning or this afternoon, but when I last checked, there were still only 2 titles that we were voting on, and they were both ones that I'd nominated. Well, of course, I nominated them. I'm happy to read them, but if there's something you would like to read, some book that is published 1925 or earlier that you would like to read together, please go ahead and nominate it. I would love to see what you're interested in reading. This one, Roughing It, was nominated by one of our readers, and so, yeah, let's see what you guys are interested in reading. And then if you see something on that list that's been nominated, please vote on it if it's something you'd like to read together. And if it's not something on that list that you want to read together, put something on the list that you would like to read together. We're going to keep that poll open through next Monday, at which point we'll announce the next book that we'll start reading during the last week of April. Okay, now let's talk about the 2 chapters that we read together on Thursday the 8th. We read just chapters 50 and 51. The first one was telling the story about a Captain Ned Blakely, and he was just talking about, because he'd been talking in the previous days, or the previous chapters, about crime and murders and juries and just, the lawlessness, the general lawlessness. And in here he was talking about a gentleman named Captain Ned Blakely who was quite honorable. Sorry, I had a question, was a snood? No, it's a hat, but it's because I messed up my hair this morning. I didn't let it dry nicely, sorry. So I put on a hat to cover it up. But yeah, I thought it worked out okay. But it would be fun to have a snood, wouldn't it? Oh, I think I tried that once when I actually had long hair, and it didn't quite work out well for me. Sorry, now I've got to try to fix it back in. Okay, that's as groomed as I get. Let's see, so Captain Ned Blakely, he was an honorable man, and it was saying how he was a tough guy, and there was another guy who wanted to fight him, and this other guy, less honorable, was named Bill Noakes. He was a bully, and it was basically saying that he tried to kind of tried to have a little scuffle kind of with Captain Blakely, and it didn't go well for him. So then he kind of got revenge later on because Captain Blakely had a, let's see, there was an African-American man on the crew who was like he was a friend of his, basically. They called him basically his pet, like they were close. And this gentleman was walking outside afterwards, and that Noakes went ahead and killed that man who was a friend and confidant of Captain Ned. And so Captain Ned then decided that he was going to get justice and he was going to kill Blakely. And it's an interesting chapter because basically he's ready to kill him right away, and he just keeps asking him, like, did you kill him? Did you kill him? And the guy's like, no. Or he's like, he won't even answer. He's like, well, and they're like, well, maybe you guys, are you trying to hang him before you even have a trial? It's like, trial? Why would I do that? Everyone knows he did it. Everyone saw him do it. And it's like, well, he needs a trial. It's like, all right, fine. We'll hang him first, then we'll do the trial. And they're like, no, that's not how it works. We need to do a trial first. I'm like, okay, fine, we'll do the trial, and then we'll hang him. It's like, well, we can only hang him if they find him guilty. It's like, why wouldn't they find him guilty? We all saw him, we all know he did it. And so there's a whole big thing about just trying to get him to admit he did it, and he will not. And eventually they do hang him. And they kind of try to make him feel a little guilty about it afterwards, and sort of like maybe is he having a twinge of doubt? Like maybe is he wondering, should he not have killed this man without giving him a longer trial, a more lengthy thing, or perhaps a better defense? And all Captain Ned's thought was actually, maybe I ought to have burned him, but I was trying to do what was best. So he only hanged the man. So an interesting look at at how justice was served in the West during those times. There was also the next chapter was about, oh, this was kind of weird, yeah. Talking about how you could tell that things were getting kind of fancy in the area, and that they were having so much money, that they were so flush, that not only could they have like so many jails and so many brothels, but they had actually had not just the regular paper even, but they had a literary journal. A literary paper was opening up. And so Mark Twain was, commissioned to help write for the literary journal. And there was basically a continuation story, like one author did a chapter. Then the next issue, another author continued the story that began in the first. And each author subsequently would continue and add to the story. And Mark Twain was really frustrated because the gentleman who had preceded his chapter did terrible things to it. He totally changed the story. He killed off a bunch of people, did terrible things. And so there was just a bit of stories about how these stories that were unforeseen and that you couldn't really predict what was going to happen. The chapter ended with him saying how the literary paper eventually kind of folded and then came back in a different form, but he was saying how he had really been excited about writing for that literary paper, and in fact he had written a poem and he wanted to share the poem with us all. So the poem, the unprinted poem as he put it, was included at the end of that chapter, and I did my best, and I thought I would be able to like enunciate the words like all on winter's day, far away to Albany, but eventually I couldn't do it. I think I had the pronunciations all off and perhaps I was over enunciating. So I just went back to, you know, just reading the words as I saw them. And so I personally didn't think it was that great of a poem, but I think that was part of the point, is that he was trying to say that his young self thought it was a wonderful poem. All right, so today there are going to be 3 chapters that we're reading. I skimmed ahead, and one has a really long article about the Chinese population. So again, as often I have done in the story, I apologize in advance for any offensive things I'm going to be reading out loud. I'm sorry. Okay, but we're just getting a picture of what life was like in the West at the time. That is a really nice tea. Okay, so let's go ahead. We're going to read chapters 52 to 54 of Roughing It by Mark Twain. Chapter 52. Since I desire in this chapter to say an instructive word or two about the silver mines, the reader may take this fair warning and skip, if he chooses. The year 1863 was perhaps the very top blossom and culmination of the flush times. Virginia swarmed with men and vehicles to that degree that the place looked like a very hive. That is, when one's vision could pierce through the thick fog of alkali dust that was generally blowing in summer. I will say concerning this dust that if you drove 10 miles through it, you and your horses would be coated with it 1/16 of an inch thick, and present an outside appearance that was a uniform pale yellow color, and your buggy would have 3 inches of dust in it, thrown there by the wheels. The delicate scales used by the assayers were enclosed in glass cases intended to be airtight, and yet some of this dust was so impalpable and so invisibly fine that it would get in somehow and impair the accuracy of those scales. Speculation ran riot, and yet there was a world of substantial business going on too. All freights were brought over the mountains from California, 150 miles, by pack train partly, and partly in huge wagons drawn by such long mule teams that each team amounted to a procession, and it did seem sometimes that the grand combined procession of animals stretched unbroken from Virginia to California. Its long route was traceable clear across the deserts of the territory by the writhing serpent of dust it lifted up. By these wagons, freights over that 150 miles were $200 a ton for small lots, same price for all express matter brought by stage, and $100 a ton for full loads. One Virginia firm received 100 tons of freight a month and paid $10,000 a month freightage. In the winter, the freights were much higher. All the bullion was shipped in bars by stage to San Francisco. A bar was usually about twice the size of a pig of lead and contained from $1,500 to $3,000 according to the amount of gold mixed with the silver. And the freight on it, when the shipment was large, was 1.25% of its intrinsic value. So the freight on these bars probably averaged something more than $25 each. Small shippers paid 2%. There were 3 stages a day each way, and I have seen the outgoing stages carry away 1/3 of a ton of bullion each, and more than once I saw them divide a 2-ton load and take it off. However, these were extraordinary events. Here's a really long footnote. Mr. Valentine, Wells Fargo's agent, has handled all the bullion shipped through the Virginia office for many a month. To his memory, which is excellent, we are indebted for the following exhibit of the company's business in the Virginia office since the 1st of January, 1862. From January 1st to April 1st, about $270,000 worth of bullion passed through that office. During the next quarter, $570,000. Next quarter, $800,000. Next quarter, $956,000. Next quarter, $1,275,000, and for the quarter ending on the 30th of last June, about $1.6 million. Thus, in a year and a half, the Virginia office only shipped $5.33 million in bullion. During the year 1862, they shipped $2.615 million, so we perceive the average shipments have more than doubled in the last 6 months. This gives us room to promise for the Virginia office $500,000 a month for the year 1863, though perhaps judging by the steady increase in the business, we are underestimating somewhat. This gives us $6 million for the year. Gold Hill and Silver City together can beat us. We will give them $10 million. To Dayton, Empire City, Ophir, and Carson City, we will allow an aggregate of $8 million, which is not over the mark perhaps, and may possibly be a little under it. To Esmeralda, we give $4 million. To Reese River and Humboldt, $2 million, which is liberal now but may not be before the year is out. So we prognosticate that the yield of bullion this year will be about $30 million. Placing the number of mills in the territory at 100, this gives to each the labor of producing $300,000 in bullion during the 12 months. Allowing them to run 300 days in the year, which none of them more than do, this makes their work average $1,000 a day. Say the mills average 20 tons of rock a day, and this rock worth $50 as a general thing, and you have the actual work of our 100 mills figured down to a spot. $1,000 a day each, and $30 million a year in the aggregate. That's from the Enterprise, and Mark Twain's note says, a considerable overestimate. 2 tons of silver bullion would be in the neighborhood of 40 bars, and the freight on it over $1,000. Each coach always carried a deal of ordinary express matter beside, and also from 15 to 20 passengers at from $25 to $30 a head. With 6 stages going all the time, Wells, Fargo, and Company's Virginia City business was important and lucrative. All along under the center of Virginia and Gold Hill, for a couple of miles, ran the great Comstock silver lode, a vein of ore from 50 to 80 feet thick between its solid walls of rock, a vein as wide as some of New York's streets. I will remind the reader that in Pennsylvania, a coal vein only 8 feet wide is considered ample. Virginia was a busy city of streets and houses above ground. Under it was another busy city, down in the bowels of the earth, where a great population of men thronged in and out among an intricate maze of tunnels and drifts, flitting hither and thither under a winking sparkle of lights, and over their heads towered a vast web of interlocking timbers that held the walls of the gutted Comstock apart. These timbers were as large as a man's body, and the framework stretched upwards so far that no eye could pierce to its top through the closing gloom. It was like peering up through the clean-picked ribs and bones of some colossal skeleton. Imagine such a framework 2 miles long, 60 feet wide, and higher than any church spire in America. Imagine this stately lattice work stretching down Broadway from the St. Nicholas to Wall Street, and a 4th of July procession, reduced to pygmies, parading on top of it and flaunting their flags high above the pinnacle of Trinity Steeple. One can imagine that, but he cannot well imagine what that forest of timbers cost from the time they were felled in the pineries beyond Washoe Lake, hauled up and around Mount Davidson at atrocious rates of freightage, then squared, let down into the deep maw of the mind, and built up there. 20 ample fortunes would not timber one of the greatest of those silver mines. The Spanish proverb says it requires a gold mine to run a silver one, and it is true. A beggar with a silver mine is a pitiable pauper indeed, if he cannot sell. I spoke of the underground Virginia as a city. The Gould and Curry is only one single mine under there, among a great many others. Yet the Gould and Curry's streets of dismal drifts and tunnels were 5 miles in extent altogether, and its population 500 miners. Taken as a whole, the underground city had some 30 miles of streets and a population of 5 or 6,000. In this present day, some of those populations are at work from 12 to 1,600 feet under Virginia and Gold Hill, and the signal bells that tell them what the superintendent above ground desires them to do are struck by telegraph as we strike a fire alarm. Sometimes men fall down a shaft there, 1,000 feet deep. In such cases, the usual plan is to hold an inquest. If you wish to visit one of those mines, you may walk through a tunnel about half a mile long if you prefer it, or you may take the quicker plan of shooting like a dart down a shaft on a small platform. It is like tumbling down through an empty steeple, feet first. When you reach the bottom, you take a candle and tramp through drifts and tunnels where throngs of men are digging and blasting. You watch them send up tubs full of great lumps of stone, silver ore. You select choice specimens from the mass as souvenirs. You admire the world of skeleton timbering. You reflect frequently that you are buried under a mountain 1,000 feet below daylight. Being in the bottom of the mine, you climb from gallery to gallery, up endless ladders that stand straight up and down. When your legs fail you at last, you lie down in a small boxcar in a cramped incline, like a half-upended sewer, and are dragged up to daylight feeling as if you are crawling through a coffin that has no end in it. Arrived at the top, you find a busy crowd of men receiving the ascending cars and tubs and dumping the ore from an elevation into long rows of bins capable of holding 6 tons each. Under the bins are rows of wagons loading from chutes and trapdoors in the bins, and down the long street is a procession of these wagons wending toward the silver mills with their rich freight. It is all done now, and there you are. You need never go down again, for you have seen it all. If you have forgotten the process of reducing the ore in the mill and making the silver bars, you can go back and find it again in my Esmeralda chapters, if so disposed. Of course, these mines cave in places occasionally, and then it is worth one's while to take the risk of descending into them and observing the crushing power exerted by the pressing weight of a settling mountain. I published such an experience in the Enterprise once, and from it I will take an extract. An hour in the caved mines. We journeyed down into the Ophir mine yesterday to see the earthquake. We could not go down the deep incline because it still has a propensity to cave in places. Therefore, we traveled through a long tunnel which enters the hill above the Ophir office, and then by means of a series of long ladders climbed a way down from the 1st to the 4th gallery. Traversing a drift, we came to the Spanish line, passed 5 sets of timbers still uninjured, and found the earthquake. Here was as complete a chaos as ever was seen. Vast masses of earth and splintered and broken timbers piled confusedly together, with scarcely an aperture left large enough for a cat to creep through. Rubbish was still falling at intervals from above, and one timber which had braced others earlier in the day was now crushed down out of its former position, showing that the caving and settling of the tremendous mass was still going on. We were in that portion of the Ophir known as the North Mines. Returning to the surface, we entered a tunnel leading into the Central, for the purpose of getting into the main Ophir. Descending a long incline in this tunnel, we traversed a drift or so, and then went down a deep shaft from whence we proceeded into the 5th gallery of the Ophir. From a side drift, we crawled through a small hole and got into the midst of the earthquake again. Earth and broken timbers mingled together without regard to grace or symmetry. A large portion of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th galleries had caved in and gone to destruction, the 2 latter at 7 o'clock on the previous evening. At the turntable, near the northern extremity of the 5th gallery, 2 big piles of rubbish had forced their way through from the 5th gallery, and from the looks of the timbers, more was about to come. These beams are solid, 18 inches square. First, a great beam is laid on the floor, then upright ones, 5 feet high, stand on it, supporting another horizontal beam, and so on, square above square, like the framework of a window. The superincumbent weight was sufficient to mash the ends of those great upright beams fairly into the solid wood of the horizontal ones 3 inches, compressing and bending the upright beam till it curved like a bow. Before the Spanish caved in, some of their 12-inch horizontal timbers were compressed in this way until they were only 5 inches thick. Imagine the power it must take to squeeze a solid log together in that way. Here also was a range of timbers for a distance of 20 feet, tilted 6 inches out of the perpendicular by the weight resting upon them from the caved galleries above. You could hear things cracking and giving way, and it was not pleasant to know that the world overhead was slowly and silently sinking down upon you. The men down in the mine do not mind it, however. Returning along the 5th gallery, we struck the safe part of the Ophir incline and went down it to the 6th, but we found 10 inches of water there and had to come back. In repairing the damage done to the incline, the pump had to be stopped for 2 hours, and in the meantime the water gained about a foot. However, the pump was at work again, and the flood water was decreasing. We climbed up to the 5th gallery again and saw a deep shaft, whereby we might descend to another part of the 6th, out of reach of the water, but suffered disappointment as the men had gone to dinner, and there was no one to man the windlass. So having seen the earthquake, we climbed out of the Union incline and tunnel, and adjourned, all dripping with candle grease and perspiration, to lunch at the Ophir office. During the great flush year of 1863, Nevada claims to have produced $25 million in bullion, almost, if not quite, a round million to each 1,000 inhabitants, which is very well considering that she was without agriculture and manufactures. Silver mining was her sole productive industry. And here's another footnote. Since the above was in type, I learned from an official source that the above figure is too high and that the yield for 1863 did not exceed $20 million. However, the day for large sums is approaching. The Sutro Tunnel is to plow through the Comstock lode from end to end at a depth of 2,000 feet, and then mining will be easy and comparatively inexpensive. And the momentous matters of drainage and hoisting and hauling of ore will cease to be burdensome. This vast work will absorb many years and millions of dollars in its completion, but it will early yield money, for that desirable epoch will begin as soon as it strikes the first end of the vein. The tunnel will be some 8 miles long and will develop astonishing riches. Cars will carry the ore through the tunnel and dump it in the mills, and thus do away with the present costly system of double handling and transportation by mule teams. The water from the tunnel will furnish the motive power for the mills. Mr. Sutro, the originator of this prodigious enterprise, is one of the few men in the world who is gifted with the pluck and perseverance necessary to follow up and hound such an undertaking to its completion. He has converted several obstinate congresses to a deserving friendliness toward his important work, and has gone up and down and to and fro in Europe until he has enlisted a great moneyed interest in it there. All right, and now chapter 53. Every now and then, in these days, the boys used to tell me I ought to get one Jim Blaine to tell me the stirring story of his grandfather's old ram. But they always added that I must not mention the matter unless Jim was drunk at the time, just comfortably and sociably drunk. They kept this up until my curiosity was on the rack to hear the story. I got to haunting Blaine, but it was of no use. The boys always found fault with his condition. He was often moderately, but never satisfactorily drunk. I never watched a man's condition with such absorbing interest, such anxious solicitude. I never so pined to see a man uncompromisingly drunk before. At last, one evening I hurried to his cabin, for I learned that this time his situation was such that even the most fastidious would find no fault with it. He was tranquilly, serenely, symmetrically drunk. Not a hiccup to mar his voice, not a cloud upon his brain thick enough to obscure his memory. As I entered, he was sitting upon an empty powder keg, with a clay pipe in one hand and the other raised to command silence. His face was round, red, and very serious. His throat was bare and his hair tumbled. In general appearance and costume, he was a stalwart miner of the period. On the pine table stood a candle, and its dim light revealed the boys sitting there and there, sitting here and there on bunks, candle boxes, powder kegs, etc. They said, "Shh, don't speak. He's going to commence." The story of the old ram. I found a seat at once, and Blaine said, "I don't reckon them times will ever come again. There never was a more bullier old ram than what he was. Grandfather fetched him from Illinois. Got him of a man by the name of Yates. Bill Yates. Maybe you might have heard of him. His father was a deacon, Baptist, and he was a rustler too. A man had to get up rather early to get the start of old thankful Yates. It was him that put the Greens up to jining teams with my grandfather when he moved west. Seth Green was probably the pick of the flock. He married a Wilkerson, Sarah Wilkerson. Good creature. She was one of the likeliest heifers that was ever raised in Old Stoddard. Everybody said that knowed her. She could have to borrow the flour as easy as I can flirt a flapjack. And spin? Don't mention it. Independent? Humph. When Sile Hawkins come to browsing around her, she let him know that for all his tin, he couldn't trot in harness alongside of her. You see, Sile Hawkins was... No, it wasn't Sile Hawkins after all. It was a galoot by the name of Filkins. I disremember his first name, but he was a stump. Coming to prayer meeting drunk one night, hurraying for Nixon because he thought it was a primary. And old Deacon Ferguson up and scooted him through the window, and he lit on old Miss Jefferson's head. Poor old filly. She was a good soul, had a glass eye, and used to lend it to old Miss Wagner that couldn't say, that hadn't any, to receive company in. It weren't big enough, and when Miss Wagner weren't noticing, it would get twisted around in the socket and look up maybe or out to the side and every which way, while t'other was looking as straight ahead as a spyglass. Grown people didn't mind it, but it was always made the children cry. It was so sort of scary. She tried packing it in raw cotton, but it wouldn't work somehow. The cotton would get loose and stick out and look so kind of awful that the children couldn't stand it no way. She was always dropping it out and turning up her old deadlight on the company empty and making them uncomfortable because she never could tell when it hopped out, being blind on that side, you see. So somebody would have to hunch her and say, "Your game eye has fetched loose, Miss Wagner dear." And then all of them would have to sit and wait till she jammed it in again. Wrong side before as a general thing, and green as a bird's egg, being a bashful creature and easy sought back before company. But being wrong before weren't much difference anyway, because her own eye was sky blue, and the glass one was yaller on the front side, so whichever way she turned it, it didn't match nohow. Old Miss Wagner was considerable on the borrow, she was. When she had a quilting or Dorcas society at her house, she generally borrowed Miss Higgins's wooden leg to stump around on. It was considerable shorter than her other pin, not but much she minded that. She said she couldn't abide crutches when she had company because they were so slow. Said when she had company and things had to be done, she wanted to get up and hump herself. She was as bald as a jug, and so she used to borrow Miss Jacobs' wig. Miss Jacobs was the coffin peddler's wife. A ratty old buzzard he was that used to go roosting around where people was sick, waiting for him. And there that old rip would sit all day in the shade on a coffin that he judged would fit the candidate. And if it was a slow customer and kind of uncertain, he'd fetch his rations and a blanket along and sleep in the coffin nights. He was anchored out that way in frosty weather for about 3 weeks once, before old Robin's place, waiting for him. And after that, for as much as 2 years, Jacobs was not on speaking terms with the old man on account of his disappointing him. He got one of his feet froze and lost money too, because old Robins took a favorable turn and got well. The next time Robins got sick, Jacobs tried to make up with him and varnished up the same old coffin and fetched it along. But old Robins was too many for him. He had him in and appeared to be powerful weak. He bought the coffin for $10, and Jacobs was to pay it back and 25 more besides if Robins didn't like the coffin after he tried it. And then Robins died. And at the funeral, he bursted off the lid and riz up in his shroud and told the parson to let up on the performance because he could not stand such a coffin as that. You see, he had been in a trance once before when he was young, and he took the chances on another, calculating that if he made the trip, it was money in his pocket, and if he missed fire, he couldn't lose a cent. And by George, he sued Jacobs for the rhino and got judgment. And he set up the coffin in his back parlor and said he allowed to take his time now. It was always an aggravation to Jacobs, the way that miserable old plug acted. He moved back to Indiana pretty soon, went to Wellsville. Wellsville was the place the Hagedorns was from. Mighty fine family, old Maryland stock. Old Squire Hagedorn could carry around more mixed liquor and cuss better than most any man I ever see. His second wife was the widder Billings. She that was Becky Martin. Her dam was Deacon Dunlap's first wife. Her oldest child, Maria, married a missionary and died in grace, ate up by the savages. They ate him too, poor fellow, biled him. It weren't the custom, so they say, but they explained to friends of his'n that went down there to bring away his things that they'd tried missionaries every other way and never could get any good out of 'em. And so it annoyed all his relations to find out that that man's life was fooled away just out of a derned experiment, so to speak. But mind you, there ain't anything ever really lost. Everything that people can't understand and don't see the reason of does good if you only hold on and give it a fair shake. Providence doesn't fire no blank cartridges, boys. That there missionary's substance, unbeknownst to himself, actually converted every last one of them heathens that took a chance at the barbecue. Nothing ever fetched them but that. Don't tell me it was an accident that he was biled. There ain't no such thing as an accident. When my Uncle Lem was leaning up again a scaffolding once, sick or drunk or something, an Irishman with a hod full of bricks fell on him out of the 3rd story and broke the old man's back in 2 places. People said it was an accident. Much accident there was about that. He didn't know what he was there for, but he was there for a good object. If he hadn't been there, the Irishman would have been killed. Nobody can ever make me believe anything different from that. Uncle Lem's dog was there. Why didn't the Irishman fall on the dog? Because the dog would have seen him a-comin' and stood from under. That's the reason the dog wasn't appinted. The dog can't be depended on to carry out a special providence. Mark my words, it was a put-up thing. Accidents don't happen, boys. Uncle Lem's dog. I wish you could have seen that dog. He was a regular shepherd, or rather he was part bull and part shepherd. Splendid animal. Belonged to Parson Hagar before Uncle Lem got him. Parson Hagar belonged to the Western Reserve Hagars. Prime family. His mother was a Watson, one of his sisters married a Wheeler. They settled in Morgan County and he got nipped by the machinery in a carpet factory and went through in less than a quarter of a minute. His widder bought the piece of carpet that had his remains wove in, and people came 100 miles to attend the funeral. There was 14 yards in the piece. She wouldn't let them roll him up, but planted him just so, full length. The church was middling small where they preached the funeral, and they had to let one end of the coffin stick out of the window. They didn't bury him. They planted one end and let him stand up, same as a monument, and they nailed a sign on it and put on it, sacred to the memory of 14 yards of 3-ply carpet containing all that was mortal of William Jim Blaine had been growing gradually drowsier and drowsier. His head nodded once, twice, 3 times, dropped peacefully upon his breast, and he fell tranquilly asleep. The tears were running down the boy's cheeks. They were suffocating from suppressed laughter, and had been from the start, though I had never noticed it. I perceived that I was sold. I learned then that Jim Blaine's peculiarity was that whenever he reached a certain stage of intoxication, no human power could keep him from setting out with impressive unction to tell what a wonderful adventure which he had once had with his grandfather's old ram. And the mention of the ram in the first sentence was as far as any man had ever heard him get concerning it. He always maundered off interminably from one thing to another till his whiskey got the best of him and he fell asleep. What the thing was that happened to him and his grandfather's old ram is a dark mystery to this day, for nobody has ever yet found out. And now chapter 54. Of course, there was a large Chinese population in Virginia. It is the case with every town and city on the Pacific coast. They are a harmless race when white men either let them alone or treat them no worse than dogs. In fact, they are almost entirely harmless anyhow, for they seldom think of resenting the vilest insults or the cruelest injuries. They are quiet, peaceable, tractable, free from drunkenness, and they are as industrious as the day is long. A disorderly Chinaman is rare, and a lazy one does not exist. So long as a Chinaman has strength to use his hands, he needs no support from anybody. White men often complain of want of work, but a Chinaman offers no such complaint. He always manages to find something to do. He is a great convenience to everybody, even to the worst class of white men, for he bears the most of their sins, suffering fines for their petty thefts, imprisonment for their robberies, and death for their murders. Any white man can swear a Chinaman's life away in the courts, but no Chinaman can testify against a white man. Ours is the land of the free. Nobody denies that. Nobody challenges it. Maybe it is because we won't let other people testify. As I write, news comes that in broad daylight in San Francisco, some boys have stoned an inoffensive Chinaman to death, and that although a large crowd witnessed the shameful deed, no one interfered. There are 70,000 and possibly 100,000 Chinamen on the Pacific coast. There were about 1,000 in Virginia. They were penned into a Chinese quarter, a thing which they do not particularly object to, as they are fond of herding together. Their buildings were of wood, usually only 1 story high, and set thickly together along streets scarcely wide enough for a wagon to pass through. Their quarter was a little removed from the rest of the town. The chief employment of Chinamen in towns is to wash clothing. They always send a bill, like this below, pinned to the clothes. It is mere ceremony, for it does not enlighten the customer much. Their price for washing was $2.50 per dozen, rather cheaper than white people could afford to wash for at that time. A very common sign on the Chinese houses was, Si Yup, washer and ironer. Hong Wo, washer. Sam Sing and Ah Hop, washing. The house servants, cooks, etc. in California and Nevada were chiefly Chinamen. There were few white servants and no China women so employed. China men make good house servants, being quick, obedient, patient, quick to learn, and tirelessly industrious. They do not need to be taught a thing twice as a general thing. They are imitative. If a Chinaman were to see his master break up a center table in a passion and kindle a fire with it, that Chinaman would be likely to resort to the furniture for fuel forever afterward. All Chinamen can read, write, and cipher with easy facility. Pity but all our petted voters could. In California, they rent little patches of ground and do a deal of gardening. They will raise surprising crops of vegetables on a sand pile. They waste nothing. What is rubbish to a Christian, a Chinaman carefully preserves and makes useful in one way or another. He gathers up all the old oyster and sardine cans that white people throw away and procures marketable tin and solder from them by melting. He gathers up old bones and turns them into manure. In California, he gets a living out of old mining claims that white men have abandoned as exhausted and worthless. And then the officers come down on him once a month with an exorbitant swindle to which the legislature has given the broad general name of foreign mining tax, but it is usually inflicted on no foreigners but Chinamen. This swindle has in some cases been repeated once or twice on the same victim in the course of the same month, but the public treasury was not additionally enriched by it probably. Chinamen hold their deed in great reverence. They worship their Chinamen hold their dead in great reverence. They worship their departed ancestors, in fact. Hence, in China, a man's front yard, backyard, or any other part of his premises is made his family burying ground, in order that he may visit the graves at any and all times. Therefore, that huge empire is one mighty cemetery. It is ridged and ringled from its center to its circumference with graves, and inasmuch as every foot of ground must be made to do its utmost in China, lest the swarming population suffer for food, the very graves are cultivated and yield a harvest, custom holding this to be no dishonor to the dead. Since the departed are held in such worshipful reverence, a Chinaman cannot bear that any indignity be offered the places where they sleep. Mr. Burlingame said that herein lay China's bitter opposition to railroads. A road could not be built anywhere in the empire without disturbing the graves of their ancestors or friends. A Chinaman hardly believes he could enjoy the hereafter except his body lay in his beloved China. Also, he desires to receive himself after death that worship with which he has honored his dead that preceded him. Therefore, if he visits a foreign country, he makes arrangements to have his bones returned to China in case he dies. If he hires to go to a foreign country on a labor contract, there is always a stipulation that his body shall be taken to China if he dies. If the government sells a gang of coolies to a foreigner for the usual 5-year term, it is specified in the contract that their bodies shall be restored to China in case of death. On the Pacific coast, the Chinamen all belong to one or another of several great companies or organizations, and these companies keep track of their members, register their names, and ship their bodies home when they die. The Si Yup Company is held to be the largest of these. The Ning Yong Company is next and numbers 18,000 members on the coast. Its headquarters are at San Francisco, where it has a costly temple, several great officers, one of whom keeps regal state in seclusion and cannot be approached by common humanity, and a numerous priesthood. In it I was shown a register of its members, with the dead and the date of their shipment to China duly marked. Every ship that sails from San Francisco carries away a heavy freight of Chinese corpses, or did at least until the legislature, with an ingenious refinement of Christian cruelty, forbade the shipments as a neat underhanded way of deterring Chinese immigration. The bill was offered whether it passed or not. It is my impression that it passed. There was another bill. It became a law, compelling every incoming Chinaman to be vaccinated on the wharf and pay a duly appointed quack. No decent doctor would defile himself with such legalized robbery. $10 for it. As few importers of Chinese would want to go to an expense like that, the lawmakers thought this would be another heavy blow to Chinese immigration. What the Chinese quarter of Virginia was like, or indeed what the Chinese quarter of any Pacific coast town was and is like, may be gathered from this item, which I printed in the Enterprise while reporting for that paper. Chinatown. Accompanied by a fellow reporter, we made a trip through our Chinese quarter the other night. The Chinese have built their portion of the city to suit themselves, and as they keep neither carriages nor wagons, their streets are not wide enough, as a general thing, to admit of the passage of vehicles. At 10 o'clock at night, the Chinaman may be seen in all his glory, and every little cooped-up, dingy cavern of a hut, faint with the odor of burning josh lights, and with nothing to see the gloom by save the sickly, guttering tallow candle, were 2 or 3 yellow, long-tailed vagabonds, coiled up on a sort of short truckle bed, smoking opium, motionless, and with their lusterless eyes turned inward from excess of satisfaction. Or rather, the recent smoker looks thus immediately after having passed the pipe to his neighbor, for opium smoking is a comfortless operation and requires constant attention. A lamp sits on the bed, the length of the long pipe stem from the smoker's mouth. He puts a pellet of opium on the end of a wire, sets it on fire, and plasters it into the pipe, much as a Christian would fill a hole with putty. Then he applies the bowl to the lamp and proceeds to smoke. And the stewing and frying of the drug and the gurgling of the juices in the stem would well nigh turn the stomach of a statue. John likes it, though. It soothes him. He takes about 24 whiffs and then rolls over to dream. Heaven only knows what, for we could not imagine by looking at the soggy creature. Possibly in his visions he travels far away from the gross world and his regular washing, and feasts on succulent rats and birds' nests in paradise. Mr. Ah Sing keeps a general grocery and provision store at number 13 Wang Street. He lavished his hospitality upon our party in the friendliest way. He had various kinds of colored and colorless wines and brandies with unpronounceable names imported from China in little crockery jugs, and which he offered to us in dainty little miniature wash basins of porcelain. He offered us a mess of birds' nests, also small, neat sausages, of which we could have swallowed several yards if we had chosen to try, but we suspected that each link contained the corpse of a mouse and therefore refrained. Mr. Sing had in his store 1,000 articles of merchandise, curious to behold, impossible to imagine the uses of, and beyond our ability to describe. His ducks, however, and his eggs we could understand. The former were split open and flattened out like codfish, and came from China in that shape, and the latter were plastered over with some kind of paste which kept them fresh and palatable through the long voyage. We found Mr. Hong Wo, number 37 Chow Chow Street, making up a lottery scheme. In fact, we found a dozen others occupied in the same way in various parts of the quarter, for about every third Chinaman runs a lottery, and the balance of the tribe buck at it. Tom, who speaks faultless English and used to be chief and only cook to the territorial enterprise when the establishment kept bachelors. Tom, who speaks faultless English and used to be chief and only cook to the territorial enterprise when the establishment kept bachelor's hall 2 years ago, said that sometime Chinamen buy ticket $1 hap. Catch 'em 2-300, sometimes no catch 'em anything. Lottery like one man fight 70, maybe he whip, maybe he get whip himself. Welly good. However, the percentage being 69 against him, the chances are as a general thing that he get whip himself. We could not see that these lotteries differed in any respect from our own, save that the figures being Chinese, no ignorant white man might ever hope to succeed in telling t'other from which. The manner of drawing is similar to ours. Mr. C. Yup keeps a fancy store on Live Fox Street. He sold us fans of white feathers, gorgeously ornamented, perfumery that smelled like Limburger cheese, Chinese pens, and watch charms made of a stone unscratchable with steel instruments, yet polished and tinted like the inner coat of a seashell. A peculiar species of the jade stone, to a Chinaman peculiarly precious. As tokens of his esteem, C. Yup presented the party with gaudy plumes made of gold tinsel and trimmed with peacock's feathers. We ate chow-chow with chopsticks in the celestial restaurants. Our comrade chided the moon-eyed damsels in front of the house for their want of feminine reserve. We received protecting josh lights from our hosts and dickered for a pagan god or two. Finally, we were impressed with the genius of a Chinese bookkeeper. He figured up his accounts on a machine like a gridiron with buttons strung on its bars. The different rows represented units, tens, hundreds, and thousands. He fingered them with incredible rapidity. In fact, he pushed them from place to place as fast as a musical professor's fingers traveled over the keys of a piano. They are a kindly disposed, well-meaning race and are respected and well-treated by the upper classes all over the Pacific coast. No Californian gentleman or lady ever abuses or oppresses a Chinaman under any circumstances, an explanation that seems to be much needed in the East. Only the scum of the population do it, they and their children. They, and naturally and consistently, the policemen and politicians likewise, for these are the dust-licking pimps and slaves of the scum, there as well as elsewhere in America. That concludes today's reading. Yeah. Kind of amazing how so many things change, and yet some things do not. Thank you for joining me for today's reading of Roughing It by Mark Twain, and I will see you tomorrow for more. And tomorrow we'll have more fancy teas to try together, and if you have not yet had a chance to vote, please do vote on what you would like to read next. Take care, friends. Bye.